Hey, what's up, everyone? So today, what we wanted to do was sort of build off of our subjunctive part one. So we're here with subjunctive part two. And in part one, just as a bit of a review, we did, really we just looked at sort of how to, right, in terms of how to conjugate the subjunctive. And so just as a bit of a reminder, step one was conjugate the verb in the first person singular present indicative. Now I'm writing that shorthand because you're already familiar with that. And so really we'll call that the Joe form, right, in the present indicative. And so with that, the conjugation will end with the letter O, right? And so then we would just drop the O. Now keep in mind we're talking about non-irregular verbs in the subjunctive. Of course, irregular verbs have their own set of endings, and so we're talking about non-irregular. And so they, for the most part, will follow that pattern there. And so, again, the how-to, so we have first person singular present indicative, that's you'll conjugate whatever verb that is into the first person singular present indicative, or Joe form in the present indicative. And again, if you need to review, the other video has all that information. Then you would drop the letter O, which you would drop that off the back end of the verb conjugation. And then you would, we keep saying add opposite endings. And that works. I think that works. And so what are the opposite endings? Just as a quick reminder, right? And so we have the AR verbs. And so whatever was, if it's an AR verb, you will add what was the ER endings, let's say, for example. And so that might sound a little confusing, but let me write this up there. And whatever way you need to remember this is totally fine, right? But so we have ES, amos, and then vosotros, and then en. And so notice that it's an AR verb, but it's taking these, and that's why I'm calling it the opposite ending. It's taking the E on the again, what would have been in the present tense, present indicative, like an ER ending, for example. And so let's just write the ER-IRs up there, because they're going to take the same endings, and they would take what would appear to be an AR ending in the present indicative. So let's just write that up there, just so we have it as some reference, right? And then we have, let's write that. Amos, ice, and ending. So let's draw a little line through there, just so you can see, separate those a little bit. And so, again, the other video and the other lesson was, we looked at all sorts of different types of ways we can do the subjunctive, from, your regular basic AR, ER, IR verb like bailar, vivir, comer, to verbs that are cargar-zar, verbs that are stem changers, and then some that are sort of like both, right, in a sense. And so, like I said, that lesson really helped, I hope at least, helped give you a fuller scope of the importance of, let's at least say, of following rule one when it comes to the present indicative. And of course, that video and that lesson isn't an exhaustive list. So, but again, our goal is to sort of begin to wrap our head around this concept. And so I'm going to leave that over there. But what I wanted to do today is sort of the next step, right? It's a bit of a scaffolding approach. And so it's important to understand how to conjugate verbs in the subjunctive. And then, of course, today is moving towards the direction of like how to use it in a sentence, right? And so that's where I have all these sentences up today. Now, what I tried to do is actually pair them with what we call weirdo. And weirdo, I'm just going to mention it today and make some brief references to it. We'll do a lesson on this on another day. But these are really just categories of verbs that require you to use the subjunctive. And so that's, we're going to talk a little bit about that today. I'm not going to go into too much detail with weirdo, but again, I'll reference it as we go through these examples. And so what I mean by the weirdo, or the idea in and of itself, you'll find it in the first clause, right? And so the first clause, I'm just going to jump right into this, right? So the first clause is everything before the K. right? I mean, you can have multiple clauses in a sentence, but for the sake of today and really, our journey learning the subjunctive this semester, we're going to stick with 2 clauses, right? But of course, you can have more clauses. And so that K sort of breaks up the 2 clauses. And so you have, this is the first clause, or also known as the main clause. And then your second clause is, again, we can call it the second clause or the dependent clause. So it's really dependent, believe it or not, upon what verb is being used in the first clause, right? And so, again, we'll get more into this in another lesson, but really I want to show you how to start putting these subjunctive conjugations into sentences, in this case, of course, in the second clause. But it's sort of worth breaking apart so we understand what we're doing as well. And so, of course, the subject for this is je. Now, keep in mind, the first clause is going to be in the indicative. You'll find the subjunctive in the second clause, right? And now, if the verb in the first clause is a weirdo, in other words, if it falls inside of one of these categories, which, like I said, I'll just keep referencing this, but our next lesson will look more deeply at the actual verbs in this. And so, of course, through repetition, you'll start to see a number of verbs being more commonly used verbs as well. And so it just takes time. So the verb in the first clause is going to be in the indicative, actually. It's and if it is a weirdo, if it falls within this category, then the verb in the second clause will be conjugated in the subjunctive, right? And of course, it must agree with the subject of the second clause. So we're going to use these examples as a way to sort of hopefully wrap our head around how this works, at least as an introduction to using it in sentences. And so let's just have a look at the first one here. And so we have necesito que tú blank por el examen. So I need, right, and this will sound strange in English if we translate it directly. So it's saying, I need that you study for the exam, right? That in there is, you wouldn't say that in English. You would just say, I need you to study for the exam. And so to show you how, if you don't understand the structure, you'll get it wrong in Spanish, I'm going to use this one in an example showing you what a common mistake, right? So like if you sort of know these verbs and you sort of have a grasp of how to put them together, but you don't understand the structure of the subjunctive, this is the mistake you'll make, right? And I'm going to show you this really quickly. So I'm going to come over here. And so we have necesito que tú blank por el examen. Now, what it's saying is I need you to study for the exam. But let's say you're like, you know what, Jason, like, I don't need your subjunctive structure. I got this. And so chances are you would say necesito. Yeah, necesito, right? And so again, we're saying I need you to study. We're just going to look at that. I need you to study. Right, so you're like, okay, I know what I need is, necesito. I know what you is, right? To, and then I know what to study is, right? Because, conjugated verb followed by infinitive. I got this, no big deal. Necesito to estudiar. Now, that's wrong, right? This is wrong. Now, you would think that you're doing it right because you're putting all these words together in a way that, coming from an English mindset makes sense, but this is the difference. Spanish, and the subjunctive in particular, it deviates from that sort of structure, right? And so that's what makes it unique and what makes it different, actually. And so, but I did want to show you, what a common mistake would look like with people who aren't aware of the structure. So new language learners that are, holding conversation and getting totally dialed in, which is awesome, they might make this sort of common mistake. And that's fine. It's all good, right? But I just want you to know that it's incorrect, and I'm going to show you the correct way, right? So we're going to draw an X through here, right? Because we don't want anyone to get the wrong impression like that's right, because it's not. So let's go on back here to number 1. So we have yo necesito que tú, right? And then we're going to put estudies, right? Yo necesito que tú estudies por el examen, right? And so, again, this is why this is wrong and this structure is right. So you have first clause, I need, necesito, right? I need, and then you have that K in there that breaks it up, right? So it separates. So you have subject, verb agreement in the first clause, and then with that K breaking it up, you create a new clause, right? In other words, that new clause needs a new subject and a new verb. And that new verb is going, because of the weirdo, right? Necesito, necesitar, right? Is going to be conjugated in the subjunctive. So what happens here is contingent upon what's going on here. So they are sort of working with one another, if that makes sense, right? And so again, I sort of placed these sentences, these samples, right beside the category that they could fall in, right? So just before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let me just look at these really quickly with you guys so you can understand. So weirdo, as you can see, you can already see the word here. I've underlined the letters, right? But the W stands for will and influence. And again, we'll have a whole host of verbs that come along with that. Emotions is the E, right? Impersonal expressions. And again, I've given you an example of that here. And I've tried to give you some pretty solid examples all the way through. But recommendations, right? Notice I have the verb recomendar. Doubt, disbelief, denial. So I'm using the verb to doubt, right? And then ojalá, tal vez, quizás, and then I'm using ojalá. So with the subjunctive, just to have a look here, with the subjunctive, you're really talking about things that you hope to happen, you recommend happen. In other words, they aren't happening, but you want them to happen, or you doubt they're happening, right? Or you just doubt whatever it is. And so we have to keep sort of our mindset within the grammar structure, much less than like philosophy or whether something is true or false, right? Because I could say, I doubt that you're in class, but you're in class looking at me. So, but because I'm using the verb I doubt, I have to use estar, right, in the subjunctive. So I'd say, dudo que estén aquí en la clase. Well, that's not true, but grammatically I have to use the subjunctive because I'm saying I doubt. And so anyways, we're going to walk through this and hopefully it'll clear things up and help to make a little bit more sense. And so, but like I said, I've sort of paired these with their categories, if you will. And again, there's many more verbs that are associated with each one of these categories, but I thought it'd be nice to kind of at least have one paired beside it. So again, we have necesito que tú estudies por el examen. We're going to move on to number 2. We're going to just walk through these and hopefully this is going to be helpful. So esperamos, right, as you all know, nosotros, of course, is its subject. So nosotros esperamos. This is clause 1. It's the main clause. Again, esperamos is a verb of emotion. So it is a weirdo. They're going to all be weirdos, actually, but I'm going to write it up there. Esperamos que ustedes, right? So now we're looking at ustedes as the subject in the second clause. Now, ustedes or tener has to be conjugated in the subjunctive to agree with ustedes, not agree with this. This is a different clause. So this, for all intents and purposes, is its own sort of sentence or block, right? And so we have to have subject-verb agreement. However, because this is a weirdo, it's obligating us to conjugate in the subjunctive in the second clause, right? And so we have, esperamos que ustedes tengan, right? Because we have ustedes, so tengo, I'll write it here. We drop the O, we add the opposite ending, it's ustedes, so we say tengan, right? So we say tengan, right? Now, so we have, esperamos que ustedes tengan un buen día. We hope that you all have a good day. Now, you could very well be having a good day at this point, but we are sort of hoping, right? It's an emotion, so we're hoping that you have a good day. And so, because of this verb in the first clause, we do use the subjunctive in the second clause, right? And of course, just to reiterate, agreeing with the subject. And so, all right, we're going to move along to number 3. Number 3 is interesting. They're called impersonal expressions, and it is exactly what it sounds like. They're impersonal, right? And so you don't have a subject here. We just have, it isn't true, as opposed to saying, I need or you want, right? So there's no subject, if you will, or it's impersonal, let's say, because the subject technically would be it, I guess. So it's impersonal. There's no person ascribed to this, right? And it's just a statement saying it's not true, it's false, it's impossible, it's ridiculous, right? All of those are called impersonal expressions. So in this case, again, we have no es cierto, so we're saying it is not true. So in other words, it's doubtful or false, which requires us to use the subjunctive. And so I'm going to show you a little something here. I'm going to go ahead and put an A here, and I'm going to erase this. I'm going to put a B here, because I'm going to show you how these work, actually subjunctive versus indicative, and also show you that really this verb translation is the same thing, whether it's the present subjunctive or present indicative, which really makes things somewhat annoying as you're trying to learn this, right? But let's take a look. No es cierto que yo viva en Miami. It's not true. Just make sure we all know that's capital M, right? No es cierto. It's not true, right? So we're under the impersonal expression, but also this can fall under this category too, because it's false, it's doubtful, if you will, right? But I put it over here so we could make some sense of it and understand what an impersonal expression is. So, no es cierto que yo viva en Miami. Now check this out. What if I wrote es cierto que yo, right? And I'm just going to go ahead and write it. Es cierto que yo vivo en Miami. Now, what's the difference? Right? And this is when we get into the difference between subjunctive and indicative, and I'm not going to go way into that today. But there's two things I want you to see. One, how these two translate to the exact same thing, and two, why one would be subjunctive, why one would be indicative, in a very briefly, right? So, no es cierto is implying, again, it's not only an impersonal expression, but even more importantly, it's showing doubt, right? Because not all impersonal expressions will require the subjunctive. Only the ones that have doubt and uncertainty and things like that, right? And so this is an example of one of those, right? That's why I put no es cierto. And so it's here and here, right? And so because it's a weirdo in the first clause, even though it's an impersonal expression, it's going to require us to use a subjunctive in the second clause. And of course, as you guys know, yo is the subject of the second clause. It's on the other side of que. Right? Now, let's have a look at this. Here I have es cierto. So now I'm saying it's true. Right? And so now it's not false, it's not doubtful, it's true. Right? And so grammatically speaking, because I'm saying es cierto, I'm using those words grammatically, this is indicative, right? It's like saying, I know that you all are smart students. Yo sé, I know que ustedes son estudiantes inteligentes, right? Now, whether that's a true or false statement is irrelevant. The fact that I'm saying I know, and you are, by the way, but the fact that I'm saying I know is making that sentence, the second clause, the indicative. In much of the same way, because I'm saying it's true, right? Es cierto. And again, there's our que, right? And this is our second clause or our dependent clause. But you can have multiple clauses and still use the indicative. That's not a subjunctive thing, right? What I want you to notice is why I use subjunctive here and why I use indicative here, right? And what happens here is contingent upon what's going on here in the first clause. And so I know I've already said this multiple times, but if it's a weirdo, if it falls within one of these categories, which we're going to look at in a different lesson, then you're going to use the subjunctive. Again, like I said, today, I just wanted you to see how to place it into the sentence and even how the sentence would translate. Again, we'll get into the more nuanced verbs in these categories in another lesson. So, okay, so let's take a look at number 4. Ellos recomiendan, so they recommend. Again, here's our que, breaking up our clauses. So we got clause 1 and clause 2, right? And so, of course, right, because these are all weirdos in the first clause, This is also a weirdo, right? And it falls under this category, recommendations, right? So we have ellos recomiendan que. Now we have nosotros is our subject in the second clause. That's what tomar is going to be conjugated to agree with. But, of course, because we have a weirdo in the first clause, we have to use subjunctive in the second clause. So it would be tomemos más agua. So they recommend that we drink more water, is what that's saying. Ellos recomiendan que nosotros tomemos más agua. Right? And so notice the translation. I know that a lot of, like I had up here, you guys were like, well, what's the translation? Well, it's the same as it would be in the present indicative. It's just the present subjunctive. So translation-wise, not much changes. It's a concept that exists in Spanish that doesn't exist in English, right? And it's a verb conjugation that changes, right? The translation doesn't really change. So I know that's a bit strange, but that's how this language works, and that's where it's different from, for example, English for you guys. So let's move on to number 5. Los estudiantes dudan. So here we go. We've got dudan, and that verb is dudar, which is to doubt. So again, we have drawn a line right here. So we have doubt, disbelief, denial. That's what the D in weirdo stands for. So we have los estudiantes dudan. The students doubt. First clause, right? First clause has a weirdo, right? So los estudiantes dudan. Que is breaking it up for us. So we have first clause, second clause. Que el profesor venir a clase hoy. So the students doubt that the professor comes to class today. So because they're doubting on this end, we have to use the subjunctive in the second clause. And so this is the subject of the second clause, el profesor. And then venir is our verb that we're using. So we would have, of course, let's just walk through the steps. Vengo, that's yo, right? Going back to this. We drop the O, we add our opposite ending. Venir is an IR verb, so we come over here for profesor because it's third person singular, and so we get venga a clase hoy. So the students doubt that the professor comes to class today. All right, let's finish up here with number 6. We have ojalá. Now, ojalá is one of these three, right? You have tal vez and quizás, which both mean essentially maybe, right? And so this means God willing, depending on where you look this up, and hopefully, right? So God willing or hopefully. And so ojalá que ustedes. And then check this out. We got a reflexive pronoun. This is going to be fun, right? Ojalá que ustedes lavarse las manos con mucha frecuencia, right? So hopefully you all, right? We've got ustedes, shorthand there. Wash your hands with a lot of frecuencia, right? Frequently, right? And so let's have a look at this. So we've got lavar. So we're going to kind of just draw two little boxes here, right? So we acknowledge that ojalá is a weirdo. So in the first clause, we've got ojalá. So in the second clause, we've got to use the subjunctive. Now, really quickly, I want to put parentheses around this because you can say ojalá and then ojalá ustedes, right, and just leave out the K. Or you can say ojalá que and then the rest of the sentence. So I'm putting it in parentheses because the grammar book will tell you it's optional. So that's up to you. Nevertheless, most importantly, is when you do use ojalá, whatever verb that's going to come in the second clause needs to be in the subjunctive. So, ojalá que ustedes. So, lavar would be in the subjunctive, right? So let's just write laven, right? Because we know that that's third person plural subjunctive. Ojalá que ustedes laven las manos con mucha frecuencia. Now we've got a reflexive pronoun we need to deal with. So, what is the reflexive pronoun for ustedes? And I'll just, it's not me, it's not yo, it's not te, right? It's not tu. And then so you have se, you have nos o se, right? And so we got a few to pick from, but it's third person plural, and you guys know good and well that se is the reflexive pronoun for third person plural, for ustedes, right? And so the sentence would read, ojalá que ustedes se laven, right, with an E, las manos con mucha frecuencia. And so here are some pretty solid examples as in terms of how to place or where to place these subjunctive verbs in the sentence. Again, first clause is the main clause, and if there's a weirdo, as we've kept highlighting through here, if there's a weirdo, which means it falls in this category, in the first clause, then in the second clause or dependent clause, we need to conjugate the verb in the subjunctive to, and of course it needs to agree with the subject of the second clause. So hopefully this was helpful for you guys. It's just another step towards really dialing in the subjunctive, which is actually quite challenging. So hopefully this was helpful.